Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.
The problem of slavery in the American Revolution. Much as slavery in the United States was a part of a larger Atlantic slave system, so America's War of Independence was an outgrowth of Europe's 7 Years' War, from 1756 to 1763, and also a precursor or harbinger of the French and Haitian revolutions, and of the subsequent Latin American wars for independence from Spain. Those foreign upheavals, really beginning with British and French fighting on the American frontier in 1755, had tremendous political, ideological, and territorial consequences for the future United States. The Anglo-American defeat of the French in 1763, followed by the winning of American independence in 1783, opened the trans-Appalachian West to American settlement and to the rapid expansion of slavery in such regions as Kentucky and Tennessee. And the independence of the United States could not have been achieved without France's decisive intervention in the Revolutionary War, followed by Spain and Holland. It is noteworthy that all these European maritime powers owned slave colonies in the New World, and had been deeply involved in both the Atlantic slave trade and the Atlantic slave system. But the wars and revolutions led to wholly new boundaries that separated regimes dependent on slavery from regions that later became identified as free soil. Although the wars and revolutions during the 50 years from 1775 to 1825 had an immense impact on New World slavery, it is still debatable whether they put the institution on the path toward ultimate extinction, to use Lincoln's later phrase. The French Revolution, beginning in 1789, ignited the almost continuous global and naval wars of the long period from 1793 to 1815, which ranged from India and Russia to the Caribbean, and which then led to the Latin American Wars of Independence. Spain had been an ally of France in the 7 Years' War, and as a result had lost Florida, a sparsely populated slave colony, to Britain. But Spain was on the winning side in the American War of Independence, and thus regained Florida. Yet after this victory, Spain began a period of great decline, especially as a satellite of Napoleonic France. Napoleon's brother, Joseph, became King of Spain in 1807, culminating with its own internal revolution in 1820 and a French invasion in 1823. Following abortive insurrections from 1809 to 1816, today's nations of Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, Chile, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, and Central America had all achieved independence from Spain by 1825. Brazil also declared its independence from Portugal in 1822. As a consequence, by 1825, France, Spain, and Portugal had been removed as major contenders in New World imperial rivalry, though Spain and France still had important slaveholding colonies in the Caribbean, such as Cuba and Martinique. Moreover, America's Monroe Doctrine, informally backed by the British Navy, stood as a warning against any further intervention by European powers, including the so-called Holy Alliance, or Quintuple Alliance. In 1775, at the start of the American Revolution, racial slavery, meaning the slavery of Africans and people of African descent, was a legal institution from Canada to Chile, and there were no restrictions on the expanding slave trade from Africa to most parts of the New World. But by 1825, Britain and the United States had outlawed their Atlantic slave trades, a commerce even declared to be piracy by the United States. Britain had also negotiated treaties with France, Holland, Spain, and Portugal, with the effect that the only remaining legal Atlantic slave trade involved ships sailing south of the equator, transporting slaves to Brazil, a commerce that was supposed to end in 1830. Unfortunately, as we have already seen with the case of the Amistad in Chapter 1, an illegal slave trade was already flourishing, and would continue for decades to deliver hundreds of thousands of African slaves to both Brazil and Spanish Cuba. Yet by 1830, slavery itself had become illegal in Haiti, where by 1804, rebellious slaves had in effect freed themselves and terrified slaveholders throughout the hemisphere, as we shall see in Chapter 8. Slaves had also been freed in Central America. Mexico outlawed the institution in 1829. Freedom also reigned in Maine, Massachusetts, New York, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. By 1830, gradual emancipation laws had eroded the number of slaves in Rhode Island, 17, Connecticut, 25, Pennsylvania, 403, and New Jersey, 2,254, as well as in most of Hispanic South America. In the British, French, Dutch, and Danish West Indies, slave labor was still highly productive, but especially in the British colonies the institution had been weakened by the decline of the slave population, occasioned by the ending of British slave imports from Africa. Thus, in 1830, slavery was a vital and thriving institution only in Brazil, Cuba, and the southern United States, as well as in the vast Islamic world, parts of India, and most of Africa. But despite all of this, from 1775 to 1825, the number of slaves in the New World had more than doubled, having tripled in the United States and increased sevenfold in Cuba. All of the New World slave societies had been highly vulnerable in wartime. Imagine trying to repel an enemy raid or invasion if you were living with what even medieval Italians termed an enemy within, potential rebels not only in the fields, but within your very households and bedrooms. Wise slaveholders knew that apparently loyal servants could become dangerous if the discipline and mystique of power and authority were weakened. Warfare always presented slaves with opportunities for escape, sometimes to maroon communities or behind enemy lines, though as valuable property, slaves were also likely to be carried off by an invader and sold. Warfare also raised the momentous issue of enlisting and even arming slaves when there was a desperate need for manpower. Though avoided by the Romans except in emergencies, this practice had long been universal in Muslim societies without undermining slavery, and usually without toppling a given regime. During the first 5 decades of South Carolina's history, as we have already noted, whites relied on the arming of trusted black slaves to beat off attacks by both Indians and Spaniards. Beginning in 1795, despite the fears and opposition of planters and other Caribbean whites, the British increasingly and effectively resorted to black West Indian regiments to save their colonies as the Napoleonic War intensified in the Caribbean and as appalling numbers of white soldiers died of disease. Black troops in British redcoats, some of them veterans of the American Revolution, and many of them enlisted soon after they disembarked from slave ships, did much to save the British regime of plantation slavery in the Caribbean. Yet a few years later, in the South American Wars of Independence, the crucial need for black soldiers on both the Spanish and rebel sides ultimately undermined slavery in Venezuela and some other parts of Hispanic America. One crucial variable appears to be ideology, a system of beliefs, assumptions, values, and aspirations. In this case, the ideals of liberty and equality associated with secular Republican principles, as well as with the evangelical religious emphasis on every person's ability to triumph over sin, thanks to a capacity to receive divine grace based on the image of God within each human being. No such ideologies of liberty and equality were present in 17th century Brazil when the warfare between the Dutch and Portuguese resulted in the flight and freedom of many slaves. Even major slave revolts from the time of Spartacus in Republican Rome to the uprising of thousands of black slaves from 868 to 883 in what is now southern Iraq were not so far as we know directed against slavery in principle. By the time of the American Revolution, however, the French, English, and Scottish Enlightenments, new forms of religious revivalism, and Anglo-American popular culture, typified in countless poems, essays, and editorials, and even plays, had helped to push slavery, in many Anglo-American minds, beyond the boundaries of accepted exploitation. As the white American colonists rose in revolt against what they perceived as a British effort to enslave them, many, especially in the North, could not escape from recognizing the contradiction of actually owning slaves. Meanwhile, though slaves throughout history had yearned for their own liberation without questioning the institution of bondage, the American rhetoric and ideology of freedom brought a wholly new perspective to blacks whose ears, and whose understanding of contradictions, were at least as sensitive as those of their masters. If most slaves were illiterate, White leaders knew or soon discovered that the slaves' networks of communication passed on every kind of news almost as quickly as horses could gallop. Take, for example, a slave named Prince, who accompanied and cared for his master, Captain William Whipple of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Prince, who had seen combat and had overheard much revolutionary rhetoric, was one of the oarsmen who had rowed George Washington and his small party across the icy Delaware River in a sleet storm on Christmas night of 1776. The following summer, according to one account, Captain Whipple asked Prince why he was so moody and depressed. Prince responded, "Master, you are going to fight for your liberty, but I have none to fight for." At this point, Whipple realized he would have to free Prince without delay. Obviously, blacks could not rely on such individual motives and goodwill in response to Samuel Johnson's famous jibe at Americans. How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? Yet owners manumitted a surprisingly large number of slaves during the Revolution or soon after. Even James Madison, after one of his slaves had been captured when escaping toward the British lines, could affirm that the young man had desired only that liberty for which we have paid the price of so much blood, and have proclaimed so often to be the right and worthy pursuit of every human being. Madison also concluded, as he promptly freed this man, that the would-be fugitive might corrupt other slaves if he were returned to the plantation. When another eminent Virginian first read the Declaration of Independence, he interpreted it to mean that he would have to manumit all his slaves. As it happened, however, the connection between slavery and the white American leaders' ideals of freedom and independence were extremely complex, as the above example of Madison suggests. We have already taken note in Chapter 6 of Edmund S. Morgan's brilliant thesis that in colonial Virginia slavery and racism became the social and ideological basis for America's dedication to freedom and equality for all whites. According to Morgan, racial slavery enabled Virginia's planter class to co-opt the poorer whites, and thus perpetuate a highly exploitive and unequal society under the banner of Republican liberty. This tradition helps to explain the paradox of a revolution that seemed to challenge slavery, but in fact entrenched and strengthened it. As one historian has written, in those Chesapeake districts, where most blacks lived, slavery was more deeply rooted when Jefferson stepped down from the presidency, 1809, than when he composed the Declaration of Independence, 1776. The freeing of unprecedented numbers of slaves seemed to evoke a more pervasive and heightened prejudice against blacks, in the North as well as the South. Another historian has summed up the growing pattern of segregation. Shortly after the Revolution, Americans began haphazardly, but with detectable acceleration, to legislate Negroes into an ever-shrinking corner of the American community. For 10 years after the war, there were some signs of relaxation. But then came a trend which included tighter restrictions upon slaves and especially free Negroes, separation of the races at places of social gathering, and the founding of all Negro churches. The American interracial mold was hardening into its familiar antebellum shape. Yet from the very beginning of colonial protests against British imperial policies, anti-slavery writers drew parallels between the grievances of whites and those of blacks. Numerous pamphlets and sermons posed the central question: if Americans feared enslavement by encroaching British power, on what possible grounds could they justify keeping blacks as slaves? In the late 1760s, Benjamin Rush, the noted physician and reformer, wrote to a French correspondent, "It would be useless for us to denounce the servitude to which the Parliament of Great Britain wishes to reduce us, while we continue to keep our fellow creatures in slavery just because their color is different from ours." While humans have always shown a remarkable capacity to accept glaring inconsistencies, especially in times of crisis, even Jefferson himself played with vehement anti-slavery rhetoric in his famous clause of the Declaration of Independence that Congress suppressed. Jefferson even ties together the British enslavement of Africans with British oppression of colonial whites, charging that King George has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating the most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people, i.e. Africans, who never offend him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Jefferson then accuses the king of prostituting his veto power by disallowing all American legislative attempts to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce, since King George was determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. By 1773, a year that marked a record number of early anti-slavery pamphlets and sermons in America, a slave named Felix sent a petition on behalf of many slaves in Boston and the surrounding province to the governor and legislature of Massachusetts. Though he worded it with extreme deference and respect, Felix expressed the key point that slaves were embittered by the intolerable thought that no matter how well they behaved, neither they nor their children to all generations shall ever be able to do or to possess and enjoy anything, no, not even life itself, but in a manner as the beasts that perish. Legally deprived of property, wives, children, a city, a country, slaves, according to this petition, were defined essentially as animals with no afterlife. Hence, even a form of relief that would bring no wrong or injury to their masters would be to us as life from the dead. As slaves and their supporters wrote increasing numbers of such petitions, the contradiction between the principles of the American Revolution and any defense of the dehumanizing institution of slavery became harder to evade, especially when slaves themselves began speaking the language of natural rights. This language had not been available even to the most rebellious slaves from Roman times to mid-18th century Jamaica. But now, from Massachusetts to South Carolina, slaves heard whites shouting indignantly about British threats to liberty, and the urgent need for resistance to prevent colonists from becoming enslaved. As early as the Stamp Act crisis of 1765, slaves in Charleston, South Carolina, watched white crowds parade around the homes of stamp officers, chanting "Liberty, Liberty," and stamped paper. Soon a group of the city's slaves followed this model and began shouting, "Liberty, Liberty," a demonstration that evoked panic among some whites. Nevertheless, as late as 1788, Robert Goodloe Harper, a young lawyer who had graduated from Princeton and would later join the Charleston Jacobin Club, could deliver a speech in the South Carolina back country asserting that slavery was a sin and that blacks were by nature equal to whites, and even calling for Negro education. Though Harper stressed the temporary necessity of slavery on purely pragmatic grounds, his rejection of racial inequality might well have led in a later time to his being lynched. But in 1794, the backcountry South Carolinians elected him to Congress. When slaves in New England petitioned for emancipation, they shrewdly emphasized their Christian faith, praised the whites for resisting British tyranny, and then appealed to the same natural rights as well as the divine spirit of freedom that seems to fire every human breast on this continent. One group of Massachusetts slaves promised to wait patiently for their award of freedom, after which they would, from our joint labors, procure money to transport ourselves to some part of the coast of Africa, where we propose a settlement, making no claims for compensation for past wrongs. Though such blacks disavowed the violent means whites were using to resist the British, white Americans became increasingly aware of the danger of a revolution within the revolution. And since only a minority of colonists actively supported the American Revolution, the manpower shortage highlighted the advantages, if not the necessity, of enlisting blacks as troops. Blacks had fought or been used as support troops in many of the previous colonial wars, and some blacks appeared among the rebellious New Englanders at the battles of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. But because of their fear of black insurrection, combined illogically with a racist stereotype of black cowardice, both George Washington, the slaveholding commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and Southerners within the Continental Congress initially opposed the enlistment of African Americans, whether slave or free. By 1777, however, the manpower shortage led various northern towns and states to enroll blacks in order to fill the troop quotas imposed by Congress. Rhode Island and Connecticut both formed all-black military units, and Rhode Island even enlisted 250 slaves with the promise of freedom in exchange for service. Some states even approved mixed biracial regiments. Later on, when France joined the war, a black brigade arrived from Saint-Domingue. It included a number of young men who would later become leaders in the Haitian Revolution. A critical turning point came late in 1778, when the British invaded Georgia in an all-out effort to enlist loyalists and conquer the southern states. Faced with this crisis, Isaac Huger, a wealthy brigadier general from South Carolina, proposed that the Continental Congress free and arm 3,000 slaves in Georgia and South Carolina, a plan strongly endorsed and promoted by Henry Laurens, a South Carolinian member and former president of the Congress. In mid-March 1779, Alexander Hamilton wrote to John Jay, president of the Continental Congress, eagerly recommending Laurens's young son, Colonel John Laurens, who was on his way to Congress and then to his native South Carolina, where he hoped to take command of the black battalions. Hamilton foresaw much opposition from prejudice and self-interest. The contempt we have been taught to entertain for the blacks makes us fancy many things that are founded neither in reason nor experience, and an unwillingness to part with property of so valuable a kind will furnish 1,000 arguments to show the impracticability or pernicious tendency of a scheme which requires such a sacrifice. But it should be considered that if we do not make use of them, the slaves, in this way, the enemy probably will. An essential part of the plan is to give them freedom with their muskets. This will secure their fidelity, animate their courage, and I believe will have a good influence upon those who remain, by opening a door to their emancipation. Upon the recommendation of a committee, Congress unanimously approved enlisting and arming some 3,000 slave troops in South Carolina and Georgia. Congress agreed to compensate the slaves' owners, and at the war's end each slave who had served well and faithfully would be emancipated, would return his arms, and would receive $50 as a bonus. Given the hopes Hamilton expressed to Jay, South Carolina's legislators may well have been right when they predicted that if this plan were carried out, the example of collective emancipation would undermine slavery in the Deep South. We should note that these two states, Georgia and South Carolina, later won momentous sanctions and protections for slavery in the Constitutional Convention and in the First Federal Congress. Despite the continuing lobbying of Henry Laurens's idealistic son, the South Carolina legislature kept rejecting the proposal, subordinating military needs to the protection of the slave labor system. Despite the precedents of arming slaves in early colonial times, for many of the Carolinians' defeat and a return to British rule were preferable to a dependence on African or African-American soldiers. Ironically, some British commanders came away from this bitter warfare in the South with precisely the opposite conclusion. Their willingness to rely on black soldiers in the American Revolution would later help them save the British slave colonies in the Caribbean by enlisting black West India regiments. Yet Southern slavery might have disintegrated if the British government had approved the proposal by Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, to conquer the South with an army of 10,000 blacks. Even earlier, in January 1775, an MP in the House of Commons had called for humbling the high aristocratic spirit of Virginia and the southern colonies by declaring a general emancipation of slaves. But England greatly feared the effects of any such move on its own West Indies, where Americans had already aroused alarm over a possible threat to incite slave insurrections. The British elites also understood that an all-out attack on one form of property could easily lead to an assault on all boundaries of privilege and social order, as envisioned by radical religious sects in Britain's 17th-century civil wars. Moreover, Britain still led the world in its dominance of the African slave trade. The powerful British merchant community would never have tolerated any military measures such as Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell's proposal to enlist, arm, and transport at least 1,400 West Indian slaves to the mainland colonies, where their very presence, according to Campbell, would induce 90% of America's slaves to desert their masters and destroy the economy. British merchants knew that such an insane plot would mean an end to the production of rice, indigo, tobacco, and other commodities for Britain, while wiping out the American market for British exports. Again, one must stress that the revolutionary ideology of the later 18th century cast a wholly new perspective on such issues as the arming of slaves and slave revolts. Imagine how white listeners felt when one of the captured conspirators in Gabriel's planned slave insurrection of 1800 in Virginia asserted that, "I have nothing more to offer than what General Washington would have had to offer, had he been taken by the British and put on trial. I have adventured my life in endeavoring to obtain the liberty of my countrymen, i.e., African Americans, and am a willing sacrifice in their cause." Clearly, the idea of natural rights could not be monopolized by white Americans. That said, we can only speculate on the outcome of the American Revolution if the situation had been similar to that in South America in the early 19th century, when Spain discovered that black troops were indispensable for crushing the first independence movements. In response, this meant that in Venezuela and Peru, in 1812 and 1814, the rebels were willing to promise freedom to any slave who would fight the Spaniards for 10 years. Yet even in most of these emerging nations, in which the proportion of slaves was no greater than in the northern states at the time of the American Revolution, the process of gradual emancipation took approximately as long as in New York State, that is, about 30 years, in New York from 1799 to 1827, in Venezuela, Gran Colombia, and Peru from the 1820s to the 1850s. Britain, when confronted by the rebellious American colonists, hoped to exploit their fear of slave revolts while also reassuring the large number of slaveholding loyalists and wealthy Caribbean planters and merchants that their slave property would be secure. Despite this contradictory approach, which could be as self-defeating as the patriot desire to resist British enslavement while defending racial slavery, the majority of American blacks probably hoped for a British victory. Such hopes were clearly nourished as word spread in late 1775 that Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, had actually promised freedom to all blacks and indentured servants owned by rebels if they were able and willing to bear arms, and fled from their masters in order to join His Majesty's troops. The fate of women and children was unclear. The beleaguered and desperate Dunmore was acting on his own initiative and had no intention of triggering a slave insurrection. Perhaps as many as 1,000 blacks made their way to Dunmore's small army, stealing food, clothes, and jewelry before reaching his ships in Norfolk Harbor. Although Dunmore's black and white troops were soon defeated at the Battle of Great Bridge, the response of American patriots, especially in the South, was little short of hysterical. The contradictions persisted. British military leaders tried to be sensitive to the interests of slaveholding loyalists who were actually given large numbers of slaves confiscated from the rebels. Nevertheless, in 1779, when Sir Henry Clinton was still at his headquarters in Phillipsburg, New York, and about to launch his Southern campaign, he made an offer of freedom somewhat similar to that of Dunmore's. All slaves captured while they were serving the rebels were to be sold for the benefit of their captors, but all slaves who deserted the rebels were given an assurance that was hardly clear: full security to follow within these lines any occupation which they shall think proper. Clinton intended this Phillipsburg proclamation to counteract the Patriots' military use of slaves and to provide needed labor for the British forces in the South. But many slaves interpreted it as an emancipation measure. In Georgia alone, some 5,000 slaves, or 1/3 of the pre-war slave population, escaped, leaving the economy in ruins and much of the black population without food. Clinton actually attempted to stop this deluge of fugitives and ordered the return of many runaways to their owners. The British eventually evacuated about 10,000 fugitives from Savannah and Charleston, and according to one estimate, South Carolina lost as many as 25,000 slaves, either through escape or death. As the historian Sylvia Frey puts it, without meaning to do so, the British Army had thus made the Revolutionary War in Georgia a war about slavery. This had the ironic effect of infuriating even loyalist whites, intensifying white solidarity, and thus contributing to British defeats and to the ultimate collapse of the British cause in America. The British invasion, occupation, and final withdrawal from the southern states led to an estimated net loss of 80,000 to 100,000 black slaves. Between 4,000 and 5,000 bedraggled blacks of all ages followed General Cornwallis's army across Virginia to the unexpected defeat at Yorktown. Even 30 of Thomas Jefferson's slaves joined the throng, and most white families along the way lost not only slaves but silk breeches, fancy jackets and shirts, silk corsets, and hats of all kinds worn by the slaves, some of whom thought they were heading to the Promised Land. In the Bible, the ancient Israelites also stripped the Egyptians of gold, silver, and clothing before heading for freedom in the Promised Land. The Egyptians supposedly consented to this restitution, since they were so eager to have the Jews leave and avoid further divine punishment. The British officers, on the contrary, fearing that their black allies would exhaust scarce provisions, used force to drive away freed slaves, many of whom died. But some blacks continued to fight. Years after the Revolution, black troops calling themselves King of England soldiers continued to harass planters in South Carolina and Georgia. A large number of African Americans who were taken by the British ended up as slaves in the Bahamas, where they trebled the black population and initiated a new era of cotton production, though some freed blacks also founded communities in the same islands. Thousands of others, including slaves of Loyalists and the veterans of some black military units, found themselves enslaved in the British Caribbean. The British shipped the largest group of freed slaves to Nova Scotia. Given the poorest land on which to farm, most of these black colonists soon became sharecroppers or tenants, disdained and persecuted by the local white population. John Clarkson, brother of the famous British abolitionist Thomas Clarkson and Britain's first governor of Sierra Leone, eventually secured a fleet of 15 ships to transport over 1,000 of these Nova Scotian and New Brunswick blacks to the supposedly free soil of Sierra Leone. Despite heavy mortality, these migrants created a coherent community united by American evangelical Christianity and revolutionary ideology. Meanwhile, by 1786, some 1,200 other African American refugees struggled to find a means of living in London, a city that offered them little in the way of employment. Since the black immigrants did not qualify for any kind of welfare governed by a geographic parish, they were reduced to begging and became increasingly destitute. A committee to aid the black poor, partly headed by the pioneer abolitionist Granville Sharp, provided some food and medical care, and then, in 1787, led the way in creating the African colony of Sierra Leone, which was planned by humanitarians as a model community that would provide a refuge as well as an economic alternative to the slave trade. When Sharp learned of the disastrous mortality of the first shipments of blacks from England to Sierra Leone, he blamed the losses on the intemperance of the people and their enervating indolence in consequence of it. Britain's removal of thousands of slaves or former slaves had the effect of committing the newly independent government of the United States to a defense and sanctioning of racial slavery as a consequence of its newly won freedom. Since slaves were legally a form of property, the government felt compelled in its earliest Anglo-American diplomacy to demand either a return of the slaves or monetary compensation. Moreover, the loss of so many slaves from the Deep South led to calls for reopening the slave trade from Africa. Georgia led the way in resuming such slave imports until 1798, when the Haitian Revolution underscored fears of acquiring too dense populations of black slaves. Yet the American Revolution had the effect of committing the northern states to eventual emancipation, and thus to the beginning of an ominous division of sections: slaveholding versus free soil. In 18th century France and Britain, courts had gradually created models of free soil by depriving citizens of any legal grounds for forcibly retaining slaves brought in from abroad. While these legal decisions validated a long-existing longitudinal boundary between slavery and freedom drawn somewhere in the Atlantic, similar to the later latitudinal Mason-Dixon line within the United States, they did not affect British or French slave trading, or the legality of slavery in the colonies. Free soil regions, meant something different in the United States, since states were contiguous and not separated by thousands of miles of sea. In 1777, early in the war, Vermont became the first region in the New World to outlaw slavery, in this instance by constitutional mandate. Massachusetts achieved almost immediate emancipation in the early 1780s by judicial decision, and New Hampshire followed suit. In 1780, when the outcome of the war was still uncertain, the Pennsylvania legislature became the first to adopt a law for the gradual emancipation of the newborn children and descendants of slaves. Though it became illegal to sell slaves outside the state, Pennsylvania's newspapers continued to run advertisements for the sale of slaves as late as 1820, and, as we have seen, there were still some 400 slaves in the state according to the census of 1830. In 1784, Connecticut and Rhode Island adopted similar measures. During the war, Connecticut's upper house had defeated a far more radical bill. Slavery was more deeply entrenched in New York and New Jersey, in which even gradual abolition bills failed until 1799 in New York and 1804 in New Jersey. Similar measures never passed the legislatures of Delaware and Maryland, though both states witnessed a drastic decline in the number of slaves and a related increase in the number of free blacks. Although slavery was not of central importance to the Northern economy, as it was in most of the South, the institution did not decline or disappear in the North because it was uneconomical, unproductive, or a burden on the economy. Yet the methods adopted for abolition brought little, if any, economic sacrifice. Since only future generations were freed in the 5 states with the most to lose, and since the children of slaves were compelled to work for their mothers' owners until the children were in their 20s, the owners, in effect, received handsome compensation for the loss of this form of property. The economists Robert William Fogel and Stanley L. Engerman, in an elegant study of the Northern Emancipation Acts, concluded that they represented philanthropy at bargain prices. Nevertheless, one should not dismiss the idealistic motives of early, mostly unrecognized abolitionists or the enduring effects of revolutionary ideology. Though in Britain there was much continuity between the early cautious gradualist foes of slavery and the radical immediatists of the early 1830s, Americans, including later historians, largely ignored the early reformers and legislators who overcame formidable opposition, especially in New York and New Jersey. Much of this hostility to emancipation in any form arose from the widespread white fear that if blacks were released from the surveillance of bondage, their crime rate would soar, and costs of their maintenance would be transferred from their owners to the taxpayers responsible for what we would call local welfare. Today we can see that such fears were based on a profound but unacknowledged racism that made the white fear of black crime and economic dependence almost universal. White authorities tended to exaggerate the number of serious black crimes and ignore the fact that most of the blacks housed in prisons, jails, and workhouses had been convicted of petty theft. In actuality, larger percentages of white prisoners were incarcerated for such violent crimes as murder, by a margin of about 5-3, and aggravated assault by about 5-4. Negrophobic racism increased dramatically after the 1780s, which meant that white society in the North barred freed blacks from most occupations and professions, to say nothing of most schools and churches, except for a few segregated ones. There were, of course, some examples of extraordinary success, such as Philadelphia's black sailmaker James Forten, who acquired considerable wealth and helped to finance William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator and the anti-slavery movement of the 1830s, and the Massachusetts sailor Paul Cuffey, who became a successful shipowner. African Americans in the North made remarkable progress in forming what they usually termed African churches and benevolent societies. But as free blacks migrated overwhelmingly into the cities of the North, they found themselves, in the words of one historian, huddled in rotten shacks, crammed into narrow menial occupations, excluded from much of the city's life and activity, harassed and assaulted, mired in perpetual poverty and often unrelieved want. They also faced continuing and increasing competition for jobs with such immigrant groups as the Irish. Since racial exclusion also interacted with the rural slaves' lack of needed skills, emancipation and movement to a less oppressive urban environment meant, as another historian has put it, stevedoring on the city's busy docks, digging graves, wells, and house foundations, and toiling as chimney sweeps, ashmen, porters, waiters, bootblacks, and in the case of women, clothes washers. Many young men, perhaps as many as 1 of every 4, made their living at sea for at least a few years. There was also the continuing danger of being kidnapped and transported for sale in the South, or even the Caribbean, something that urban abolitionist societies tried to prevent. Before leaving the Revolutionary and early national periods in the United States, we should at least touch on the momentous question of lost opportunities, and what I have termed elsewhere the perishability of revolutionary time. No one can doubt that the 1780s witnessed a great upsurge of anti-slavery fervor, in the Upper South as well as in the North, in Britain, and even in parts of France. In the United States, with the exception of Georgia and South Carolina, there was a broad commitment to end slave imports from Africa. Though many planters in the Deep South were deeply concerned over their declining rice economy and their loss of slaves to the British, Americans in general expected that the federal government would outlaw the slave trade in 1808, following the 20-year restraint imposed by the Constitution. Virginians, to be sure, were partially motivated by their own shift toward the cultivation of corn, wheat, and other grains, and by their wish to sell some of their growing surplus of slaves to the Deep South or Southwest. Still, in 1782, Virginia passed a law that eased and even encouraged private manumissions. In 1784, the Continental Congress came within 1 vote of passing Jefferson's bill that purported to exclude slavery from the entire Trans-Appalachian Territory, that is, from the territory that would become Alabama and Mississippi, as well as from Kentucky and Ohio. While we should not exaggerate the practical effectiveness of that measure, the vote would have been inconceivable 20 years later. And the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 did exclude the future entry of slaves into the Western Territory north of the Ohio River, though, as future events would show, blacks would be brought in as de facto slaves, and struggles would be required to keep Indiana and especially Illinois from becoming slave states. No less significant is the fact that many national leaders, including Washington, Franklin, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, John Adams, John Jay, Gouverneur Morris, and Rufus King, saw American slavery as an immense problem, a curse, a blight, or a national disease. If the degree of their revulsion varied, they agreed that the nation would be much safer, purer, happier, and better off without the racial slavery that they had inherited from previous generations, and some of them would emphasize from England. Most of them also believed that America would be an infinitely better and less complicated place without the African American population, which most white leaders associated with all the defects, mistakes, sins, shortcomings, and animality of an otherwise almost perfect nation. Nevertheless, as can be seen in Hamilton's 1779 letter to Jay, there was some genuine interest in laying a foundation for future emancipation. But even foundations can mean postponement. As Jefferson put it, at age 43, we must await with patience the workings of an overruling providence, and hope that that is preparing deliverance of these our suffering brethren. Having failed to gain approval for an emancipation measure in his native Virginia, Jefferson felt that the time was simply not ripe for decisive action. And as momentum grew in the economically troubled 1780s for a stronger and more centralized government, it became crystal clear that no union would be possible unless the northern states were prepared to sanction and even protect the South's most vulnerable institution. Thus, any serious push for even an eventual end to slavery would mean, by the loss of union, that the Founding Fathers could take no immediate and effective actions to secure America's borders, or strengthen the nation's shaky credit, or attract foreign investment and diversify the economy. And though the framers of the Constitution were determined to avoid the words slave and slavery, which had long carried extremely negative connotations, they finally proved willing to meet most of the Southerners' demands. The fury and outrage with which Georgian and South Carolinian representatives in the First Congress in 1790 reacted to respectful and cautiously worded anti-slavery petitions from Quakers and from the Pennsylvania Abolition Society were like a weather vane pointing toward the storms to come. The petition from the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, signed by its president, the elderly Benjamin Franklin, called on Congress to step to the very verge of the power vested in you for discouraging the slave trade, and to countenance the restoration of liberty to those unhappy men who alone in this land of freedom are degraded into perpetual bondage. Congressman Thomas Tucker of South Carolina warned that any attempt to free Southern slaves by law would lead to civil war, and James Jackson of Georgia asserted that slavery was not only allowed by the Savior, but positively commended by the Bible. In reply, Franklin, shortly before his death, wrote a satirical letter to the Federal Gazette, putting parts of Jackson's speech in the mouth of a Muslim Algerian ruler defending the enslavement of Christians. To plunge for a moment into the realm of the hypothetical, in 1860 and 1861, Virginia and the Upper South in general were very slow in following the Deep South in seceding from the Union, following Lincoln's election in 1860. In many ways, the slave-holding states were not truly united. Therefore, one can only wonder what the United States might have been like if Georgia and South Carolina had joined the Caribbean colonies in not rebelling in the 1770s and in remaining part of the British Empire. This would surely have deepened the difficulties for British abolitionists, but might possibly have saved the United States from a civil war. We can summarize the gains of the American Revolutionary period as follows. The immediate abolition of slavery in Massachusetts and northern New England, where the African-American population was small but not insignificant, a commitment to gradual emancipation in the other northern states, and adjacent territories moving west from Ohio to the Mississippi River. This meant that opponents of slavery could reasonably count on a larger expanse of free soil in future decades, presenting a potential peril to a South now marked off as a slaveholding land that might begin to shrink even further if Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, or even Virginia were to follow the path of Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. And, as we have seen in parts of the North, the percentage of slaves had been similar to that in parts of the Upper South. Moreover, by 1798, when Georgia finally took action, all the Atlantic seaboard states had prohibited the importation of slaves from Africa or the Caribbean. This encouraging development was somewhat undermined by South Carolina 5 years later, largely in response to the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, and to the expected demand for slaves in the West. South Carolina threw open its ports at the end of that year. By January 1, 1808, when the federal government finally outlawed the African slave trade, the state had imported some 38,000 slaves, more than in any previous decade. Still, the nation as a whole was shocked and angered by South Carolina's action, in part because whites did not want a nation with more and more blacks, enslaved or free. Finally, and most important in the long run, was the Revolution's legacy of ideology, the popularization among blacks as well as whites of a belief in individual freedom and inalienable natural rights. The period from 1765 to the early 1790s produced countless numbers of tracts, pamphlets, broadsides, sermons, speeches, and editorials that challenged the basic core of slavery, the belief that human beings could be animalized, that they could be degraded to the level of chattel property. In some ways, this revolutionary ideology, epitomized by the opening lines of the Declaration of Independence, showed that the very idea of slavery is a fiction or fraud, since liberty and equality are fundamental rights that no one can legitimately lose. This mode of thinking would have as great an influence on the free black David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, 1829, as on Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. As 19th-century abolitionists and feminists would show, these values of the Revolutionary era were open to very radical interpretations and applications. They would be extraordinarily inspiring to some privileged slaves, to many free blacks, and to white abolitionists who fused religious zeal with a sense of irrevocable human equality.
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.